Bore da pawb, good morning everyone. Bore da Michael, bore da Sophie. Diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you so much for being here for this very important conversation to start the Beyond conference in Cardiff. I was reminded, Sophie, hearing you speak, I'm aware every day we live in Wales, we're fortunate to have this well-being of future generations. It's something we think and talk about all the time in our decisions, in the way that we're doing our business. And I'm aware that we're the envy of many nations around the world. And it's very reassuring when you live in a small country. That's by population data, not by size of heart, just to clarify when we say small nation. That our nation is thinking about the future of its people and the future of Wales. So, Sophie, given your opening thoughts, can you tell us what role you think the creative industries has in building a world for future generations, including maybe designing solutions for the future and telling stories about how we might get there? Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I think there are so many ways. I think often when you talk about the creative industries, it tends to be, in that kind of economic context. What's the economic benefits of a really strong creative industry in a particular area? And of course, that's important. But actually, I think we need to sort of track back a bit. If you think about the power of creativity and culture in terms of those being a key skill for the future. So, I sort of perhaps mocked a little bit the English curriculum, which is more Latin and less life, and wouldn't say Latin is particularly focused on the sorts of skills that young people are likely to need in the future. What is one of the key skills? It's creative thinking. And therefore, far from seeing kind of creativity as a nice to have, we should be building it in as an absolute core to the way in which we deliver education to our children and young people, and that is what we're doing in Wales. I also talked about the power of, harnessing culture in a range of different public services. And as I said, I've got this sort of aspiration of there being creatives in residence in every public service in Wales. And, we're seeing them pop up more and more. During the pandemic, the Welsh Government, I think, I'm not sure if Scotland did, I don't think England did, but I think the Welsh Government were the only government to deliver a kind of basic income, if you like, or a furlough scheme for creative freelancers. And we worked with the government to try and take that a bit further to say, well, actually, in taking that forward, could we also look at kind of keeping almost a register of the skills of creative freelancers in terms of pairing them with public institutions where they could be delivering some of the things like I've described, like storytelling from communities to inform corporate plans, like how we can see the health benefits of some of the cultural intervention programs, like we could have social prescribing, where instead of writing a prescription for antidepressants, you might write a prescription to join a choir or to join an art group or whatever it might be. So I think that there's some huge power in the cultural and creative industries, not just being over there, being seen as an economic asset, but being seen as a core asset in terms of the delivery of public services and public policy in Wales.
Creatives in residence in every public organisation. Now that would be a thing, wouldn't it? Michael, you've worked in the creative sector throughout a period of our growing understanding about the environment and the impact that we're having on the planet. What do you see as the most effective way for us as creatives, as a room of creatives here, to tackle these issues? What opportunities do you see for us to craft and tell stories? And you might want to reflect, Michael, on or comment on how COVID has enabled this or not. I'm thinking particularly of the brilliant stage that you wrote and performed and shared with us.
Right. Yes. Hello, everyone. Staged, for anyone who doesn't know what it is a series, well, we've done 2 series so far, that I filmed in my kitchen. And it was myself and David Tennant and our respective partners. We decided to tell a story during the lockdowns about what it was like, I suppose. And it is interesting in that it brings up a few different things that is, might be interesting to think about in the context of Beyond. One is about how do we as storytellers tackle issues, which is tricky because, you know, you feel passionate about whether it's about the climate crisis or whatever the issues might be, and you want to be able to address those in a creative storytelling way. But I've found really, I suppose, no matter what the issue is, ultimately creativity is irrational. It's if you sit down by committee or sit down and go, I want to write this, then you're kind of already ending the conversation with the bit of you that is the best at writing things, which doesn't really go by rules and kind of sneaks up on you with stuff and comes out of surprises and coincidences and accidents and that kind of stuff. And ultimately, I think we, as creatives and as an audience, respond to things that break the rules and don't go in straight lines and don't tackle things head on. So with Staged, when we were starting to work on that, we had a few different choices about how we told the story and how we used technology to tell the story. And that's the second aspect of it, about how we use technology. We were aware that there were a lot of things being made because suddenly, you know, content was being shut down. People weren't able to make the things that they were making. I was doing a series in America that got shut down because of COVID. And so there was a kind of a race to get stuff out about the situation we were all going through. And we were kind of aware that other people were going at it from the point of view of sort of, how can we still make something really high quality and look like it's not being done in the lockdown and under pandemic conditions, but to be about what we're going through. And as those things started to come out, they were very earnest and very serious and very issue. And we had sort of decided that we were going to try and tell a story that was about what was going on, but it wasn't going to be directly about what was going on. And that we would let it sort of creep up on people. And also, we decided that we would lean into the technology that we were all having to use. So rather than trying to come up with a kind of something that looked like what things would normally look like on BBC One or BBC Two or whatever, we decided, no, we'll do it over Zoom or, you know, other formats are available. But we would do it in the way that everyone was sort of talking to each other at the time, and we would lean into that use of technology. Because partly we wanted to allow the audience to feel familiar with what was happening, because what we were actually trying to do was quite pioneering in some ways and quite bold and risky and ambitious. But because it looked so rubbish on the screens and exactly what everyone else was sort of going through, then it sort of allowed people to feel included in it. So essentially what I'm saying is that it brings up two things that I think are sort of pertinent to what we're probably all, you know, trying to think about at the moment, which is, how do you tell stories about issues? Well, the thing is, you don't tell stories about issues. You tell stories about people, and you tell stories about, you know, all kinds of things, and the issues are there, I suppose, and you have to be really careful about how you do that, because your passion to inform and educate can kind of limit the irrationality of storytelling, which is ultimately what people engage with, I think. So there's that aspect of it, and that's for a much longer conversation. And then there's also the use of technology. It's really interesting hearing Sophie talking about tech. And, you know, we think of the sort of progression of technology and that it's constantly evolving and getting more and more complex and futuristic. I would say that Staged is an example where, of all the things that came out in lockdown, it was the one that was the most lo-fi and using the most basic technology that actually was most effective in getting the story across. So it's not necessarily about the development of technology all the time. It's about, how do we use technology? How do we evolve the way that we relate to technology in order to tell our story? What is the best way to tell our story with the technology that's available? And it's not necessarily always the most cutting edge. So I suppose that raises two things. I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, I'm sure we all enjoyed being welcomed into your kitchen, like we welcomed everyone into everybody else's kitchen for the last 2 years.
What book should be behind me in this became the thing that everyone was thinking.
So, Sophie, when there are so many priorities, and there are many, and I'm sure we'll unpick more and more as the day goes on, how can we as creative thinkers, designers, makers be ambitious about the future, whilst also being realistic and practical? Because that is a key consideration for us all too. Thinking big is great, but how do we make it have impact and be realistic?
I think, you know, a lot of, if I go back to those kind of, you know, those 5 principles which are in the Future Generations Act, they are common sense, whatever, you know, whether you're making public policy, whether you're, you know, making a drama, whatever you're doing, whatever industry that you're in, you know, what's the kind of long-term impact of what you're doing? And, you know, we would say across social, economic, environmental, and cultural well-being. And that kind of holistic nature is really important, because you might be thinking, oh, I'm going to do this, you know, I'm doing this, it's absolutely brilliant, and it's going to have a long-term impact in terms of, you know, culture, creativity, and so on. But if it's having a really negative environmental impact, you haven't really considered the long term. If it's, you know, done in a way which excludes people or those who can't afford, and so on, then you're not really having the social impact that perhaps you could be having, and that has long-term consequences as well. So that kind of, you know, long-term, what is it that we're sort of trying to prevent? How can we think holistically, so not just in the silo of what we might be doing and why that might be important for us to deliver, but what does that mean more broadly? So like I said, thinking about environmental impact, social impact, and so on. Who can we partner with? And, you know, I think the creative sector are really good at partnering. As I said earlier on, sometimes I think you're knocking the door of others who, you know, who don't necessarily get partnering with you, and I think that that's a big problem for the public sector in terms of not working as well as they could be with you, not harnessing the power that you bring. And then finally, sorry, and on that point then I would say please do keep knocking the door, especially knock the door in Wales, because at least the door in Wales is ajar, and, you know, whereas because of the Future Generations Act, whereas it might be more firmly closed elsewhere. And then, you know, finally involving citizens, and again this is something that I think you're really good at doing, telling those stories, you know, telling the story of the lived experiences of people. You know, Michael was describing that there, but I could point to, you know, any number of you know, creative programs and events and so on that are really, really good at sort of telling that story. So keep doing more of that.
Thank you. That segues very nicely into our next question for you, Michael, if I may. So your work is very engaged with societal shifts, with highlighting current challenges of the people of Wales, but also further afield, and addressing, most importantly, inequality and giving all people, a voice. How important is this to you when you consider what work you engage with and whose stories are told? Why is that so very important?
Yeah, well, as Sophie was just saying, the idea of long-term sustainability around storytelling then, you know, I suppose one of the fundamental things is about whose stories get told. And it's not just about other people telling those people's stories, whose voices don't get heard enough. And part of a project that I've been working on the last couple of years, A Writing Chance, which was an initiative to support and develop and promote underrepresented voices in fiction, non-fiction, and journalism, was exactly about that. And then we did a podcast series called From the Margins to the Mainstream, which was each episode highlighting each of the 11 writers that were our first cohort of people through the Writing Chance program. And that was about saying, well, there are voices that just don't get heard. There are voices that are massively overrepresented in our society and our culture. And if we're lucky, we hear about the experiences of certain people, certain communities, through those massively overrepresented voices, because they deign, like the Eye of Sauron, to turn their spotlight onto those communities. But actually, we need to hear from the people themselves, the communities themselves, and making sure that we look at, first of all, what are the barriers to that? Because, you know, you can't swing a cat for meetings about inclusivity and accessibility. So if that was all working well, then we'd be hearing from those voices. So something's not quite right there. So first of all, looking at what are the barriers and the obstacles to hearing from those people, and why are they not represented, and why are their voices not heard, and then creating the pathways for that. And that was, you know, what A Writing Chance was and is about, looking at those pathways for people from communities, whether it's to do with what we used to call working class voices, don't know what we call them anymore, but people from certain kinds of financial backgrounds, or people who are, you know, living with mental or physical health issues, or people who are caring for people with physical and mental health issues. You know, it's across the board. But why are we not hearing from them, and what can we do to support them? Because, you know, as a culture and as a society, if we only ever hear from people at one end of the room, even if it's about what the view of the other people at the other end of the room is like from that end of the room, we're still going round in circles with our conversations. And the sustainability of us as a culture and as a society, I think, is dependent on what are the stories we're telling. I sometimes think about we're like moving into the future like astronauts with a helmet on, but that helmet, that visor that we're looking through, is our storytelling. We understand the world and our place in it, where we've been and where we can go to through the stories that we tell, what is reflected back to us about who we are. And if there are certain people and communities that just don't come up on that visor, then we're just going to walk around in circles into the future. And that's, you know, we don't want to be doing that. The idea of a free-flowing information in any network has to mean that information is coming from the outer edges, from what would be considered the margins, into the center. And so we have to make sure that information is flowing. But it has to come from the people themselves, the voices themselves. So I think, you know, moving into the future, in terms of how we tell stories, first and foremost, we have to make sure that all the stories are being heard in a way that represents who we are.
I think you're absolutely right. And there's some good work happening here, but there's lots more to do. Talking about doing, Sophie, I'm aware you shared with us this morning that your term as Future Generations Commissioner is coming to an end. Could you reflect on some of what you've done in the last 7 years, and maybe some of what you see in the future for the next commissioner? What are the blockers to the Act? You know, what challenges do we have? Big question, but a few thoughts.
How long have we got? I mean, you know, you can have a law, can't you? And that's great that we've got a law in Wales, but if you think suddenly just by having a law we're going to change the mindsets of every single politician and every single person who takes decisions across Wales overnight, then you're kidding yourself, really. And that's the big challenge. I mean, I always describe the Future Generations Act as the biggest cultural change programme Wales has ever seen, because what we're trying to do is not just unpick the habits of a lifetime, but unpick the habits of very many lifetimes. And those habits are, you know, only things like the obsession with GDP, things like we only plan in 5-year cycles because those are electoral cycles, things like we only budget annually because that's just kind of how we've always done it, things like I'm going to protect my budget and I don't want to share my budget with you, even though actually we might get better outcomes if I share my budget with you. So those have been kind of some of the challenges, and we're trying to unpick every single part of the system. So if you think about, you know, even just like the healthcare system, for example. So the performance measures in the healthcare system are all about, you know, how long your ambulance took to turn up, your time to treatment, how satisfied were you with your 10-minute GP appointment. Actually, a much better question to ask is how satisfied are you with the quality of your life? And when you start getting into that sort of conversation and you start working through what actually matters to people, it's not about that narrow 10-minute appointment with the GP where you might be going because you might be depressed or you might need a hip replacement or whatever it might be. But actually, to have prevented that in the first place, we need to harness the power of everyone in this room. We need to harness the power of all of the environmental NGOs who could be doing, you know, various things in nature to support communities. We need to harness the power of better, higher quality work and those good employers, and make sure that every employer is a good employer. We need to do things which are beyond the healthcare system, for example, to fundamentally transform how we think about health and well-being in Wales, and that's hugely challenging. There have been some huge wins here in Wales, things that we thought were not possible when we started this sort of journey on the Future Generations Act. So I mentioned some of the transport interventions. So, you know, now the way in which our government plans transport strategy is it puts walking and cycling right at the top of the transport hierarchy, building roads right at the bottom. Our whole infrastructure investment budget, 2/3 was spent on building roads. It's now gone down to 1/3. We have a pilot of a universal basic income here in Wales, seen as not possible just, even 2 years ago. But in Wales, pieces of work that I've been doing with others, really mapping out that if we want to get to the root causes and the long-term consequences of people living in poverty, we actually need to think of completely fundamentally different things to do rather than fiddling around the edges of a broken welfare state. And so we're having a pilot initially targeted at those leaving the care system, the most disadvantaged young people in society, who will receive £1,600 a month for 2 years, with a massive evaluation wrapped around that to see what the benefits of that might be to roll out elsewhere. I talked about our curriculum, and I'm so excited about our new curriculum. I've got 5 children. The eldest is 23 and the youngest is 8. My 23-year-old, three of my 5 are dyslexic. They are incredibly creative, and their skills have not been recognised in a school system of old, and yet their creative skills are exactly the sorts of skills that are going to be needed in the future. And the difference between my 23-year-old dyslexic child and my 8-year-old dyslexic child in terms of their experiences in school, what they're coming home telling me that they're learning about in schools, couldn't be further apart. So my 8-year-old is benefiting from Wales being the first country in the UK to have Black history as a mandatory part of the curriculum. She's coming home, a little anecdote, that was out having a glass of wine with a few mums. One of them said her daughter had asked for a whittling knife for her birthday. Now, I'm not sure, and 2 other mums said, oh yeah, Maisie's asked for one too, and so on and so on. Now, I'm not sure about the benefits of buying a whittling knife for an 8-year-old, but that one tiny little anecdote shows what is happening in our curriculum. Our curriculum, part of it is connecting children back to nature. Kids at the moment, 15-year-olds, can name over 1,000 corporate logos, but can only name 5 species of tree. And, this is the world that we have created. So when you have those little moments of saying, my daughter's coming home asking for a whittling knife, my daughter is harnessing her creativity. My daughter knows that she's excellent and she's special and she's got these special talents, which my son never knew. That's the thing that makes me incredibly excited and incredibly passionate and proud about the work that we've done here in Wales.
I suppose that's a good place to end our last question on, which I'll put to Michael. But in terms of the future generations, you've talked about your children there. When I mentioned to my daughter I was having a conversation with you today, Sophie, she asked me if you had a crystal ball given to you when you took on your job, because she couldn't quite understand how somebody would do that role otherwise. So yeah, interesting perception there. Yeah, that comes with the job. So, Michael, thinking about the future generations then, can you give us some thoughts on the role that young people play in the vision for the future? Now, I'm aware that you've set up a fund to help people tell their stories. We were talking about that in the last question you answered. How do you engage young people to do that? How do you work with young people? How do you see their role in the future, in helping us make decisions, in advising us grown-ups, if you like, about what might be?
Yeah. Well, one of the challenges, I think, is that there's been a lot of focus, and there is a lot of focus on being able to support young people who are coming through. Let's say, like I set up a bursary, a scholarship for young people from Wales coming from working class backgrounds, going to drama school or going to university, and the focus around the idea of young people who don't have much money, don't come from a background of money, family don't have much money. How do you make that transition into, whether it's the creative industries or any industry, but where you're expected to work for nothing, or it's just good for you, pay your dues and all that kind of stuff, that certain people aren't able to do that. So is it only certain kinds of people from certain kinds of backgrounds? And there's a lot of focus around that. But more and more it becomes clear to me that that you've already missed out a huge number of young people if you're leaving it that late. When as a football player, I was scouted when I was like 11, 12, but to be able to go to a big club. But nowadays, if you're not finding young people, kids at 5, 6, it's already, you're already leaving it too late. with football, why can't it be the same for creative people? You know, why aren't we able to create the opportunity to look for talent, to spot talent, to nurture it, develop it, create those pathways? My own personal pathway to the life that I've had and the career I've had has disappeared over time. I've watched it disappear, like, you know, footprints on the beach. It's just gone. And that was part of what started to make me realize how much I'd taken for granted about, you know, but extraordinarily, it wasn't just my brilliant genius that had allowed me to have a career. I realized suddenly, looking back more and more as I got older, how much work, how many people had gone into creating those opportunities for me that I took for granted, and how difficult it was for that to still exist. And that was for me, who had a lot of privileges and a lot of opportunities, a supportive family, a supportive community. What about for the young children who don't have that? So creating those pathways for young people, I think, is incredibly important, and you can't leave it until they're 16, 17, 18, although that still obviously needs to be there, that support. But also, you have to hear from young people, you know, you have to hear from what their voice is, what their hopes and their aspirations are. Particularly around, you know, the sort of work that I do as well. When I was growing up and watching TV, I mean, I sort of got the idea there were actors. I didn't really get the concept of directors. I still don't get the concept of producers. But the idea that there were other things out there as a young person just didn't occur to me. You have to get young people onto sets, into the places where creative things are happening, so that, you know, children and young people can see that there are people who do hair and makeup. There are people who carpenters, lighters. There are people who blow shit up and get paid for it. I mean, I remember having a conversation with someone very high up in the South Wales Constabulary years ago, and he said to me, "Oh, you're from Port Talbot. The kids burn the mountains down every summer there, don't they?" I was, yeah. And I said, and it's funny, isn't it? Because just down in Swansea, there's a studio where people get paid to set things on fire. And if you could, you know, and I met that guy a few years later, and he said, I always remembered that. And when we arrested, when the kids that were arrested, we took them down to the studios, and one of them has got an apprenticeship on the pyrotechnics thing. And you think, well, so I think that sort of highlights something, which is that we have to show what opportunity there is. We have to create the opportunity. We have to create the pathways really early, and allow people in to see what's going on. And also, just as a last thing, I think I would like to see children, young people growing up, as Sophie's talking about as well, the sustainability around culture as well. You know, whilst being open to the world and welcoming and open to the influences of other things, we also, as a smaller nation, you know, have to protect who we are, our culture, our past, and celebrate that. And that begins with knowing about it. It took me until I was in my 40s to really start understanding what our history is as a people in Wales. And you know, I would want young people to grow up feeling connected to the past, not being stuck in it. You know, as Raymond Williams talked about, it's the idea of how the past affects the present that is important. But to understand who we are, and where it's possible to go to for us, we have to understand where we've come from and be realistic about that, and be open and ready, and be open to being challenged about that as well. So there are many versions of history, but I would love, I think, for future generations in this country to be able to grow up with a secure sense of owning where we've come from, what our past is, and therefore being kind of warts and all open to why we are where we are, and why we face the challenges we do, and what we need for the future, so that we can move into the future with confidence and boldness and ambition and courage. That's what I would like to see.
Thank you, Michael. So that concludes the opening session for the day. Welcome to Wales. I think that gets us off to a brilliant start. I hope you understand more about us as a nation, as a sector, as thinkers, as idea generators, and some of our ambitions for the future. There's much to do. I think that's another clear message that's coming across, and that's for all to talk about, think about, and come together to collaborate and think about ideas that are significantly going to change the future for us all, not just our sector, but globally. Diolch o galon. Thank you ever so much. All the best for the rest of the conference.
Enjoy.